Hello everyone. I'm going to talk today a bit about the metaphoric usage of the term nanmin over the last years in Japanese media, its influence on society, and Japanese policymaking when it comes to refugees. I chose this topic after the talk about the refugee detainee centers by Professor Slater and Rosa Barbaran, mostly because I wanted to learn more about why is Japan accepting so few refugees compared to the other countries that we saw in the article. Little spoiler ahead here, as some of you might already think, obviously there's more than just one simple reason for a complex topic like this, so I had to think about a way how can we deal with the situation. So the approach that I followed for this presentation is that we could define society as a complex machine with many different gears and parts that, if working together, in the end produce a certain outcome or product. In this situation, it would be the current Japanese refugee policy. So instead of looking at this whole topic and just asking broad questions, for example, like why does Japan refuse to accept refugees, it would make more sense to look at single parts of the whole puzzle, or of the machine in this case, and try to analyze their importance and effects. I would argue here that the metaphoric usage of the term refugee in the recent period is one of those parts, and that we can define metaphors as a mirror of society while really considering that language can change perspective. So just to freshen up your memory fast, it's important to remember that Japan ratified the 1951 Refugee Convention, which states a refugee, according to the convention, is someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reason of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. So talking about this topic, I just want you guys to keep that in mind. Okay, so if we look at the terminology of the Japanese word nanmin, the most common translation would be equal to the English word of refugee or displaced person. It's also important here to know that in most cases this term is still used in this way. However, roughly over the last 15 years, a second and alternative usage has gained popularity. This started in 2007 when the Japanese writer Hiroaki Mitsushima published a book in which he uses the term net cafe refugee or neto cafe namin to refer to mostly male people without fixed address or place to live who almost always sleep in 24 hours internet cafes. Pretty much this is the first time that the word nanmin or refugee was used in another context than it is described in the 1951 Refugee Convention that we just looked at. In the beginning, the usage of the word in this specific context provoked quite some controversy, but it became popular quite fast and the public discussion about it kind of faded away. And then shortly after the book was published, a quite famous documentary about net cafe refugees by Nippon Television won an award by the National Association of the Commercial Broadcasters. And after that, the term was selected as one of the 10 new words of the year. Quickly, some of the biggest media outlets in Japan started frequently writing articles on this topic. I picked here some of the more recent articles as an example and to show you that this process is actually still ongoing. So here we have 3 quotes by 3 of the biggest and most read newspapers in Japan. The Mainichi wrote in 2020 an article which was about free housing for net cafe refugees during the COVID time. The Asahi Shimbun wrote in 2021 an article which was generally about homeless people, but as you can see here, for them it was quite important to exclude internet cafe refugees from the group of homeless people. The last article by the Nikkei Shimbun, published in 2020, talks about internet cafe refugees in Tokyo in general. Interestingly here, they take information from the Tokyo metropolitan government, which shows us that's not only the media side that uses this terminology, but also the official government side. So if you go back in time, and we go back to 2007, when the book was published that we talked about, from this point on, we can definitely see that this metaphor, the metaphor of nanmin, transitioned to a variety of other topics. The way how that would look is like this. Now the terminology of nanmin is used in a variety of different situations. For example, there's something called insurance refugee. Insurance refugee describes people unable to access proper healthcare insurance. Another one would be, for example, an information refugee. Pretty much people without the access to adequate education or information. Important to notice with this specific website or with this specific article here is this article was published by the Ministry of the Internal Affairs and Communications. So we can again see that this terminology is not only used by media outlets or private people, but also by official organs. One more, which is probably a bit more abstract, would be shopping refugees. Pretty much just people who can't buy food for multiple reasons. Can be they don't have enough money, or they don't have a supermarket in their village or in their town. Just a very, very broad term. So take a second and try to keep in mind what you think when you hear the word refugee. And then have a look at some more examples. As you might see here, there's words like, for example, Starbucks refugee, which pretty much only describes people that couldn't go to Starbucks because it was closed during the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Or there's a term called lunch refugees, which again only describes people unable to have lunch. These are just some of the examples that I found, and some are definitely more commonly used than others. But one thing that I found especially noteworthy was that during the early stages of the COVID-19 outbreak, rather than focusing on the actually or real refugees that we talked about, that were facing unprotected infection danger in the detention centers, in Japanese media and in the Japanese public, the term PCR refugee became popular, which describes people that couldn't get a PCR test and therefore couldn't go traveling. So from here on, what can we take from that, and from what can we conclude? Hosokawa describes this as follows. He says that the term refugee is thus often used for situations in which a social divide creates a problem for a particular group of people, depriving them from a given service or facility. So what is here quite important for us to notice is that even those terms that we saw before describe the situation of people that are in need or in hardship, it also leads to the fact that the word refugee and its definition, as it is described in the 1951 Refugee Convention, changes its importance. We can say that it changes from an international situation where we have people that are in need for protection, that are fleeing from war and hunger, to a domestic and social perceived problem. In many other countries that have a way higher refugee intake, we can see the change of policy has often its roots from protests and citizen movements from within the society. I would definitely argue that this kind of usage of the word refugee is one of these parts which, on the one side, hinders the process for more liberal Japanese refugee policy making, and on the other side also, at least to a certain extent, changes the perception of the Japanese public. One of the main problems that I found when trying to find some more information about this topic is that actually very little research has been done on that specific terminology. There's almost no sources that talk about it until now, and this notion in general has not really been perceived as an issue. If something is not perceived as an issue, already raising awareness is going to be quite difficult. I hope that was interesting for you. If you want to learn a little bit more or read a little bit more about it, I can definitely recommend you the paper by Hosokawa or some of the other sources that I write here, or have a look at the Japanese websites where I found all of those terms. I'm also going to put them into the video description, so it should be easy for you to access them. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward for your questions.